Hi team, this is the first lecture for the Rome campus edition of PSYC207. It's Joel, hi. I'm just very technologically unadvanced, so I'm filming this with my phone. I'm pointing it at the screen and I can't see myself as well, so you'll just have to bear with me. If you have these slides open, you can follow along on your laptop, or you can just watch them through here. Okay, so we're going to start off with each class that we do, each topic, we're going to start off with a question. Right, so a very simple one for this video podcast, topic 1A, what is culture? And the question that we have to go with this is, how do we quantify and explore the relationship between the human mind and cross-cultural variations or intercultural variations? So what is it between or within different cultures that are the same? And what is it between and within different cultures that are different? And how can we measure these for psychology? Okay, so maybe the most useful way to start off is to give you a little bit of an idea of my theoretical perspective, and that is as an evolutionary social psychologist. Right, so we're going to have a discussion about the evolution of the human mind. So it's probably easiest to think about this in terms of any type of natural selection or evolutionary mechanisms, and that is that there has to be some kind of adaptive advantage for traits to be passed on. So for example, in the animal kingdom, when we look at giraffes, we know that giraffes have long necks, and that this is something that has adapted over time because the longer a neck is, the more likely it is that that particular giraffe will be able to get food. So the ones with the long necks eat and live, and the ones with the short necks starve and die. And the ones that live, obviously, live to pass on their genetic makeup. Right, so the same thing happens in the human world. Physical traits get passed on as a function of how we adapt to our environment, right? So, for example, skin color, it's not adaptive for people of very pale skin to live in very harsh climates where the sun will burn them and they will die of cancer. They can't pass on their light colored skin, so people with darker skin colors get to pass on those genes. So in humans, we have lots of evidence for how that's happened physically, and arguably exactly the same thing happens with the mind. Certain parts of our mind will be adaptive to our environments and they get passed on, and others don't. So over thousands and thousands of years, people living in different parts of the world will have certain cognitive functions that are different to people in other parts of the world. Right, and then in more modern times, since we've started traveling and people of different cultures have been mating with each other, mixing all of these genes up, we start to have this really interesting interaction between culture and psychology, and then psychology back to culture. And so we've got this cycle now that we're quite interested in exploring properly. There's lots of evidence for this, some very simple things in terms of how we communicate with each other. So I have here a picture of people having a cross-cultural communication breakdown. One person here thinks that it's appropriate to bow upon meeting. The other person thinks that it's appropriate to handshake. And actually you can see here that they're each trying to predict what the other is thinking. More evidence. If we think about things like visual differences, things that we can see, these are very apparent. Things like written languages. Some languages, such as ours, use letters, others use pictographs. Lots of things such as clothes, food, preference for housing, the composition of housing, whether we live just in our immediate nuclear family, whether we live with our extended family. We have some less visible things to do with ideologies and norms and values. For example, how we greet each other. And then deeper down are our key beliefs, right? Things that are not visible. We can't see what someone believes, but these things are super important because they are very good at predicting behaviors. They're good at predicting how we interact with each other. Here's some actual evidence. So what you can see here is that there was one study in which they had half European Americans and half Eastern Asians from Beijing both do this same study. In one they were asked to do a relative task, and in one they were asked to do an absolute task. So the relative task was to do something in the same vein as the original task, and the absolute task was to do something in its entirety. What you can see here is that the oxygenation patterns in the brain, or where the red and the yellow parts of the picture are coming up, are very, very different. So for a European American, whenever they are doing a relative task, they get all sorts of activation in both cerebral hemispheres, both at the front and at the back, or the anterior and the posterior. Whereas for the same task, the Chinese participants, Eastern Asians, had a very limited bit, just around here, across the top of the temporal lobe. The reverse is true when you come across the absolute task. You can see that there is no activity down here from Americans, which you might, if you're being cheeky, suggest that means Americans don't use their brain at all when they need to do absolute tasks, but I would never say that. And up the top here, in the Eastern Asians, you can see that there is limited amounts, but more. So there's some neurological evidence, which is pretty binding. It's pretty hard to fake this kind of evidence. So that's pretty great. Okay, we're going to talk a bit more big picture now about psychology and where cross-cultural psychology fits into the picture, or where culture has a role to play in psychology. So there's two broad goals for psychology. Very basically speaking, we have building knowledge about people and then applying this knowledge, right? So we have half of the people involved in psychology are doing research, conducting research, creating theories about this research, testing these theories, and building an evidence-based. So for example, people who come up with, the people who came up with cognitive behavioral therapy theorized around it. They came up with these sets of theories that they thought could predict and change behaviors, and then they tested it. They published this knowledge. These become the articles that we read in psychology classes. And then the other half of people working in psychology are applying this knowledge. These are the people who are practitioners of psychology. So the people doing the practice, the people who are working with people, teaching people how to intervene with things, working with the clients one-on-one, and this is doing application. Cross-cultural psychology, psychology and culture is interested in both of these, both building knowledge about psychology and culture and then applying the knowledge. Right, so what are we talking about? The problem with the cultural focused psychology is, as with all psychology, all of our knowledge comes from a very specific type of population. So up until recently, all psychology research was conducted by old white men, and the participants in these research studies were mainly white, young males. So what we basically have is about 90% of the knowledge that we have is the psychology of white males, which is problematic because that really is disproportionate to what the world is, right? So there's this acronym that we use in cultural psychology called WEIRDOS. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And so when we talk about weird psychology, we're talking about the psychology of basically any evidence that we have that has come from studies conducted on students from America. CP, cross-cultural psychology, cultural psychology, is a method, right? So when we're talking about cross-cultural psychology, we're not talking about anything specific. So for example, when we talk about developmental psychology, we're looking at how psychology changes across the lifespan. When we talk about clinical psychology, we're looking at abnormal deviations from normal behavior. Cross-cultural psychology isn't like that. It's a method for testing things, right? What that means is we might be a cross-cultural clinical psychologist. We're interested in knowing how clinical variations to human behaviors change or are perceived differently across cultures. Right, we have a whole topic of this coming up, but a basic example is in some cultures, people who hear voices are assumed to be crazy, and in other cultures, people who hear voices are assumed to be the chosen one, or an enlightened one, or a point of contact that a religious deity is having, and they become leaders. Right, so they get treated very, very differently based on the culture. Right, so I've got this question down the bottom of this screen here. It says, do behaviors from one culture hold for other cultures? And this is basically the driving question of this entire unit. We want to know what behaviors that humans have, what cognitions that humans have are constant across all cultures, and which ones are different. That's all we're doing. Cool, I'm going to skip over this because you can read about it in the book. Some definitions. What is culture? I'm just going to read this. Culture provides social protocols for surviving. Right, so what we're talking about here is social protocols get passed on between generations. People learn things from their parents, who learn things from their parents, and that way we're never reinventing the wheel. right? And in this way, when we think about culture as being something that's passed on between generations, cultural knowledge, as a rule, is always improving, right? So if we think about all of the home tricks that we have, tricks of the trade that we learn from people who have come before us, they're never passing on bad information or information that's going to make life worse. They're only passing on stuff that's going to make things better. And it does become specific to our culture because it's based on our environment. Right, another factor that's worth thinking about when we talk about what is culture is thinking about the ways in which people adapt to their environments, which produce ways of thinking, ways of living, or ways of behaving. So one of my favorite examples for this is cultures around the world who have a siesta in the afternoon. In certain parts of the world, it is not adaptive. It's to no one's advantage to work during the middle of the day. It's too hot, it's bad for you, you can't think, you can't be productive. So instead, those people have adapted and they now have a siesta, and then they wake up refreshed and they can work a little bit further into the evening. If you were to take that same lifestyle, the siesta, napping in the middle of the day, let's say you were from Mexico and then you moved to Finland, where there is fewer daylight hours, and those daylight hours happen at the time in which you would normally be siestaing, that's completely unadaptive. You would be sleeping through your daylight hours. And depending on what your work is, you wouldn't be able to get anything done. Right, so that's a good example of how the environment can shape the ways we think and the ways we live and the ways we behave. Right, and these things all then become part of a group's culture. I have two cross-cultural theorists here who have different things to say about this. The first one is Tyler, who in 1865, very, very early on in the psychology game, said that culture is capabilities and habits learned by members of society. Right, so Tyler thinks that it's something that is learnt, capabilities and habits that are learnt. And in this way, we're talking about observational learning, things that you see, you then try, and if it works for you, you keep doing it. Linton, however, in 36, still very, very early, but solidly after Tyler, said that instead of it being something that we learn, it's something that is passed on to us, social hereditary, as per that definition at the top of this slide. From our textbook, page 15, the authors of our textbook, Matsumoto in particular, said that culture is a unique meaning and information system shared by a group and transmitted across generations that allow the group to meet basic needs of survival, pursue happiness and well-being, and derive meaning from life. Right, that's a pretty all-encompassing definition. The important parts here is that culture is a unique meaning and information system. So he's claiming, well, they are claiming that culture is a system. It's shared by a group and it's transmitted across generations. Right, so we're talking about a meaning or information system that is shared by a group. People pass it on to their younger generations, and it allows cultures to have this whole flourishing of outcomes, meeting survival needs, pursuing happiness and well-being, and deriving meaning from life. These are all nice things. They then go on to say that it's more than just this. It creates complex social institutions. It institutionalizes and improves cultural practices so that we get back to this not reinventing the wheel. And then it communicates these meaning systems to other humans and subsequent generations. So it's allowing culture to become entrenched into our way of life. I've tried to put this into a cycle so that we can see the function of culture. Right, so culture comes about because we have a group life. Humans are these social creatures. We like to live in groups. We like to share our lives with each other. This then allows or necessitates humans to have social complexity, right? Meaning that we have to behave differently depending on what the situation is. In some situations, it's perfectly fine to be loud, very extroverted, very outgoing. In others, it's not really appropriate. So we learn in our social complexities when it's appropriate to do each of these things. As our cultures become more and more socially complex, we then have a need for social coordination. Right? So as social complexity continues, we then need things like systems of government, people who are going to set rules and procedures and protocols, and then also people who are going to police those rules and procedures and protocols. Right, at this point, we start to have our culture become really entrenched. And then the function of culture is that it facilitates behaviors that increase coordination and reduce social chaos. Right, and then that cycle becomes complete. Factors that influence the creation of culture. There's three big things here that we're going to touch on, And these are ecology, resources, and people. Right? The textbook argues that these are three big encompassing features, three big things that influence how culture is created. Right, so with ecologies, we'll talk about each of these in more detail, but we're talking about climate, population, and arable lands. Resources, we're coming down to competition for food, water, and money, or access to food, money, and water. And when it comes to people, we're talking about group living situations, our unique needs and motives as humans, and the universal toolkit. Right, I'm going to touch on each of these in more detail, but first I just want to go back to this universal toolkit. So I've taken a picture from your textbook. We're talking about cognitive abilities, emotions, and individual differences or personality traits. Lots more about that in your book. Factors influencing culture. First, we'll talk about ecology. Right, so I already had the example of the siesta before. Right, there are very different climates across the world, and each climate has very different demands of the people that live in them if they're going to survive. Right, so largely, a lot of our evidence for the factors, ecological factors that influence culture, are based on how people look, those physical differences. So for example, Norwegians are very tall and slender. Asian people tend to be shorter because they're adapting to their cultures. The reasons that these things happen have to do with the outcomes that these different climates have. So in warmer climates, food spoils quicker, right? So there's no point in collecting lots of it and storing it because it's going to go off. There are more infectious diseases and parasitic diseases in warmer climates, which means that people need to be much more careful about these things. There's a greater need for shade to avoid dehydration, sunstroke, these sorts of things, and people need to avoid the middle part of the day. Right, on the flip side, in colder climates, especially in the extreme colder climates, there can be food shortages, which means that you need to gather and store food when you can and conserve energy, not burn off all of those carbs. You need more clothes, more shelter, you have to plan your travel arrangements, and you have to organise your life around the sunlight. Right, and that's not just which hours of the day you're going to work, but which months of the year are you going to be working, growing crops, and in the more extreme conditions, some places they don't have daylight for months at a time, so you'll be indoors for all of those months. These things are worth thinking about. Right, the research shows that it's actually not about the absolute temperature. The absolute temperatures aren't driving culture so much as how much the temperature deviates from a temperate climate. Right, so the argument here is that humans must regulate their body temperature to 22 degrees Celsius, right, and that in some climates this is easier than in others. So the further the further the environment's temperature is from 22 degrees Celsius, the more that is going to have to shape the culture. The more people are going to have to adjust their living ways, their experiences, how they behave to be able to match that. Next thing with ecology, the population density. Right, what we're talking about here is the ratio of people within a specific area. So for example, people who have ever lived in a city such as Beijing or Tokyo will know that personal space is very, very different. Someone who's lived in any part of regional or rural Australia will not have that same sense. Their sense of personal space will be much more, let's say, much larger. What this means is people have had to adjust or adapt to their living arrangements, their environment, and this changes the way people's cognitions work. So what you will find is people who have been raised in these environments or whose family come from these environments of high density have a very different definition of personal space, of depth perception, of appropriateness of body contact. People who come from cultures where there's these densely populated places will drive very differently. People who come from a different culture will see that type of driving as aggressive or even dangerous. And it's purely because of the differences in the culture have meant that the people have had to adapt to having cognitions that have different perceptions around these things. Okay, the book goes on to say that it is more than this. It's not just the ratio of people to an area, it's the ratio of people to arable land, or land which can grow food, basically. So the argument here is that evolving climates that come with arable land mean that people have to adjust to things to account for things such as food shortages or surplus, to avoid excess food that's going to rot and attract diseases, attract flies. Parasitic and viral diseases both come with different climates, arable climates, and of course the type of clothing that is appropriate to create and to wear in these environments. Cool. The next thing that we're going to talk about after ecology is resources, right? And what would over time, what was really important is the presence or absence of natural resources, right? This isn't such a big deal today because we have different currencies that we can use to buy natural resources. But before that was a big thing, you know, just in the last 40, 50 years, natural resources really did have a big impact on the environment, which in turn influenced culture, right? So if there was an absence of natural resources, you by need had to have a less densely populated environment, right? When there's limited resources, this requires people to adjust to ensure that they survive, right? If you have a limited amount of food, but your culture is that you procreate widely, have as many children as you can, you will all die, right? So that cycle, the psyche, or the cultural factor that says you should have as many children as you can, will actually mean that you get bred out of existence. Other things about resources, it can actually encourage intergroup teamwork and community spirit, right? So if, you know, we live on this side of the river and we have lots of corn, you live on that side of the river and you have lots of cows, therefore you have lots of milk. We'll grow enough corn for us and you make enough milk for us and you, and then we'll share. Right, so it can really do a very good job of creating teamwork, community spirit. It can foster trading and pooling of resources, and it can also allow you to open up your genetic pool, right, so that you're not interbreeding so much with your own closely related cultural community. Right, but of course the flip side of this is that resources obviously can also be a cause of intergroup hostility or war, right, and that's obviously unfortunate at best. We won't go into that too much. We have a whole topic on intergroup hostility coming up. I'm not going to go into that. Whoa. You can read about that in the textbook. Okay, and then the final thing is worth thinking about is the type of people that are in the environment which will influence the culture. Right, so as we talked about before, humans are social animals. We have evolved, or we are designed to live in groups, which apart from immediate companionship, such as will keep us sane and means that we will have people look after us when we're old, it also allows for us to divide labour. Right, this means that we can farm large amounts of food at once. If we divide the labour up, we can survive animal attacks, we can survive disease attacks, etc. Right, so it allows us to pass on our genetic gene pool. The question then becomes, do the advantages of companionship outweigh the potential for social conflict? Because obviously if you're living in groups where there's very few people around, you have less companionship, but you're also less likely to fight or argue or have disagreements over things. Needs and motives. Okay, so we've got here that survival equals the degree to which people can adapt to their environment. And then I've got a point here which I took from the textbook. It's got to do with the meaning of life, which says that survival is related to the reproductive success, right? This is a very evolutionary approach to things, right? Survival is related to reproductive success. Evolutionary psychologists would argue that our sole purpose in life is to pass on our genetic gene pool. Cultural psychologists, on the other hand, tend to think that survival means how much can you adapt to your environment, right? Together, these things make up cross-cultural psychology. Different people have different needs and motives around what it means to survive or how important it is to pass on your gene pool. Right, we're going to talk about that a lot more in the third topic. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on really briefly again about this universal psychological toolkit, in which we talk about the coevolution of the mind and the brain. So the mind and the brain evolving together. Right, so humans, above other animals, have this unique ability to symbolize the metaphysical world. Right, so we have things like writing, morphemes, rules that will allow us to govern both writing and morphemes. We have sophisticated art, we have sophisticated music, we can debate, we can have other higher order cognitive abilities such as morality, precision judgment making, some important decision making things. And these all come from that universal psychological toolkit, which is the final thing that can influence culture. There's a whole section in the book that I'd like you to have a look at about whether culture is uniquely human. Right, so I've got here, well, the question is culture uniquely human? Is this a human phenomenon? The short answer is, the evidence says animals are also social. Right, we know this, we have flocks of birds, packs of wolves, swarms of fish. Very few animals live on their own or even coupled. They all live in packs. Animals invent tools, as do humans. Right, so for example, monkeys have been found to make tongs out of twigs, and which was previously one of the things that we argued. Humans make tools, other animals don't. Then animals can communicate. Right, whales have a very nuanced form of communicating with different sounds. There's lots of animal body language. We even have evidence that bees communicate through dance. So given the arguments that we had before about what makes a culture, that we're social, that we have higher order cognitions, that we communicate, based on this, it would seem that culture is not uniquely human. Animals seem to have cultures as well. However, the difference is that human culture is characterized with these three things. This is quite important: social complexity, social differentiation, and institutionalization. So our culture becomes institutionalized, it becomes a way of life. We have social differentiation. Our culture allows us to highlight differences between people, for better or for worse, and social complexity. Cultures allow our societies to become more complex, whereas in the animal kingdom, culture doesn't have these same functions. Right, so I've got this example here that, yes, the original argument was that humans make tools, animals don't. Then all of this evidence came out of the literature that said, look, animals also make tools. Monkeys make tongs out of twigs. But to supersede that, humans make tools that make tools. We have factories that make spanners and hammers and pop rivets. So these are the arguments for what makes human culture different to animal cultures. Okay, that was the first one. It was the big one. The next ones will be shorter. The next topic that we have, topic 1b, is an introduction to the theories that can be used to quantify culture. So this one will be shorter, but it's going to be super important, and I ask you to please make sure that you get your head around those different theories, because we'll be referring to them throughout all of the topics to come. Thanks.